ever since news broke last Friday that a new Spider-Man ride-sharing deal had been reached. The initial narrative making the rounds was that Sony had gained nothing. Marvel and Disney were the ultimate winners of that particular transaction. However, that narrative is in need of some modification. At the time, I speculated that for the deal to happen, Disney must have granted Sony something big, such as the right to use Spider-Man in their movies, even while the deal with Marvel remains in play. And they didn't have that before. Now, more and more outlets are coming around to the same conclusion. Spider-Man will start showing up in Sony's Marvel movies. In this editorial, I will give my take on why everyone wins on this new deal, but why, contrary to what some have reported, Sony won more, and why odds are good that this deal might get extended. The gist of the new deal is that Spider-Man will make 2 more appearances in the MCU. Obviously, the as of yet untitled Spider-Man 3, plus he will appear in 1 more Disney Marvel movie, which has yet to be announced. In terms of funding, Deadline Hollywood has revealed that Disney will put up 25% of the movie's budget in return for a 25% equity share. Those are the facts as we know them, because that is the information that the 2 parties have chosen to share with the public at this time. There most certainly is more to the deal than they have chosen to share, but based on what they have told the public, the narrative that Sony caved in to Marvel's demands came to start making the rounds. Based on the known facts, it might at first glance appear that Sony were indeed the losing party in this transaction. You see, that 25-75% split is the exact same split that Disney offered Sony in the beginning of the year, but Sony would have none of it then, and left Marvel hanging for 6 months. That's when Marvel increased their offer to a 50-50 split, before calling the whole thing off due to meeting a bricked wall in the other end. Sony then issued their rather nasty comment in which they blamed Kevin Feige not having the time to spend on Spider-Man for no new deal happening. That, of course, was bullcrap. Feige would be happy to take on Spider-Man. Problem was, Sony wanted to take Spider-Man back and go all in on their Venomverse, now starring Spider-Man, and that was the end of that. The narrative that Sony somehow caved in also hinges on the recent announcement that Kevin Feige will be making a Star Wars movie. The narrative goes that this had Sony spooked, because they wanted to work with Feige all along, they were just hardballing for a new deal. When they saw that Feige had moved on, they came back to the negotiating table, tail tucked between their legs, and accepted the deal Marvel offered in the beginning of the year, without getting any more out of them. This is a narrative I did not and do not buy into. As we've established in numerous earlier videos, Sony's endgame is to take Spider-Man back and put him into their Sony Marvel universe, or Venomverse, or whatever you want to call it, the one they can make without Marvel and see 100% of the profits from. Sony shareholders aren't overtly concerned with which cinematic universe Spider-Man resides in. Their priority is increasing Sony's share price, bottom line, and dividend. If the numbers tell them that having Spider-Man under their control in their own Sony cinematic universe is more conducive to their financial goals than having him locked up in the MCU, then that's what they're going to do. And that is the course they appeared committed to take. In order for them to waver in that commitment and allow Spider-Man to remain in the MCU, Marvel had to offer Sony something more, something Sony wanted, and which wasn't on the table before. The one thing Sony always wanted was to have Spider-Man appear in their movies based on Spider-Man's villains, so that audiences would think these Sony movies were also part of the MCU. Sony were very, very keen for that to happen.
Well, those movies will all take place in the world that we are now creating for Peter Parker. I mean, there'll be adjuncts to it. They may be different locations, but it will still all be in the same world, and they will be connected to each other as well.
So there is a chance that Tom Holland as Spider-Man will pop up somewhere over there. There's always a chance.
There's always a chance.
After that statement, Feige made Pascal walk back that comment in a follow-up interview for the very reason that Marvel didn't want audiences to confuse Sony's productions for official installments of the MCU. It is for that very reason that the original deal stipulated that Sony couldn't use Spider-Man in movies that weren't co-produced by Marvel for as long as the deal was in place. Sony tried to bypass this. We've previously covered how Sony reportedly filmed a Tom Holland cameo for Venom, in which he played an uncredited, nameless random passerby, whom the audience would still recognize as Peter Parker. But Marvel didn't let it slide, and made Sony cut the scene. Because that's where Marvel drew the line. They couldn't prevent Sony from making a Marvel universe of their own, but as long as Spider-Man was in the MCU, they would not allow him to appear anywhere else, as that would blur the lines between the genuine MCU and Sony's knockoff version of it. Do note that this is speculation on my part, but I think this is what Disney had to concede to Sony in order for the deal to come together. I think Marvel had to grant Sony the right to use Spider-Man in their movies, even while the deal which sees him appear in the MCU is in place. Between the lines, Kevin Feige himself has admitted as much. About Spider-Man and the New Deal, he said, "Spider-Man also happens to be the only hero with the superpower to cross cinematic universes. So as Sony continues to develop their own Spideyverse, you never know what surprises the future might hold." That sounds like something Amy Pascal could have said, and that Kevin Feige would have made her take back. Now, he's the one saying it. To me, that is a pretty clear indication that Marvel has conceded Sony the use of Spider-Man while he is in the MCU. Even if that means blurring the lines between the MCU and Sony's Spider-Verse, let that be the official title. I think that's a concession Disney had to make in order for the deal to happen. But I don't think that is what brought Sony back to the negotiating table in the first place. I also don't think Disney's announcement that Kevin Feige would make a Star Wars movie had anything to do with this deal coming together now. You wanna know why? Because he didn't drop out of Star Wars for Spider-Man. Kevin Feige is still making that Star Wars movie. However, I do think securing the services of another key individual behind the scenes had everything to do with getting the parties talking again. After directing both Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, Jon Watts had made the movies he was contractually obligated to do, and free to take on other jobs. There were earlier reports that both Sony and Marvel were competing for his services. Sony wanted him to make Spider-Man 3 for them, while Marvel wanted him to make an as-of-yet unannounced movie for them. Logic dictates that he would have been more interested in working for Marvel. Because why on earth would he risk damaging his career by making a third Spider-Man movie, one that would be compromised by all MCU elements of it being removed, when he instead could further his career by making something completely different and utterly without restrictions for Marvel? Again, this is pure speculation on my part, but I think the higher-ups at Sony Pictures, those who walked away from Marvel to begin with, suddenly came to realize that making Spider-Man 3 without Marvel was going to be more difficult than they had anticipated. I also think they might have come to realize that if Sony's own Spider-Man 3 failed to be as successful as Marvel's Spider-Man Far From Home, after they decided not to renew with Marvel, then Sony corporate in Japan just might cut their careers short as a reward. Now that Sony and Disney have come to terms, they have together approached Jon Watts about directing the third movie, which now will be unrestricted MCU. At the time of making this video, he's already in quote-unquote final talks. More often than not, that means it's already a done deal. In short, everyone wins on this. Marvel wins because they get to keep Spider-Man for 2 more movies, long enough to get over the honestly pretty boring looking Phase 4. and into Phase 5, which should have both the Fantastic Four and the X-Men to rekindle audience interest after the all-too-satisfying and all-too-concluded Endgame. Sony wins, because not only will Marvel get them out of the cliffhanger they were stuck with after Far From Home, but they win even more, because this seemingly lets them use Spider-Man in their own Spider-Verse movies, like the upcoming Morbius and Venom 2, while Spider-Man remains in the MCU. That tacitly legitimizes the Spider-Verse movies as MCU as well, which is what Sony always wanted. 2 MCU appearances down the line, they even get to take Spider-Man back full-time, and putting him into their by then established Spider-Verse. If they want to, that is. Sony wanted out of the previous deal to establish their own Spider-Verse with Spider-Man, but this new deal seemingly grants them that, while Spider-Man remains in the MCU. So why would they want to get out of it? If anything, having Spider-Man continue to appear in the MCU beyond the next 2 appearances would continue to further validate their own Spider-Verse. We don't know what the future holds, but I think there is a better chance that this deal will end up getting renewed than the previous one, which we warned would fall apart ever since Venom turned out to be a hit with audiences. This one has the potential to be renewed indefinitely. That is what I think. Now let me know what you think of all of this in the comments.